Now, G7 climate talks here in Berlin have ended with a commitment by the group of 7 leading industrial nations to largely end the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity by 2035. Russia's invasion of Ukraine pushed the phase out of coal and the introduction of renewable energy sources up the agenda, with many countries, including Germany, still dependent on Russian coal, oil and gas. The meeting also accelerated partnerships to tackle climate change.
I've started already, but...
DW political correspondent Julia Saudelli joins us from the summit here in Berlin. Welcome, Julia. So just talk us through what's been agreed.
As you've said, one of the important points that was announced here at the summit was the push to stop electricity production with fossil fuels by 2035. But that is not the only thing that was committed to. The countries here also pledged to reduce carbon production within the transport section in the coming years, but also to stop using coal to produce energy. We do not have a deadline for that goal to be reached for the phase out of coal for the entire G7, signaling that there is a desire for each country to go their own way on that. But we also heard a pledge for the G7 countries to support developing countries in the adaptation to the consequences of climate change. And that underlines the importance of the fact that it is the developing countries that are bearing the brunt of the consequences of climate change. There was also focus put on the protection of the environment from problems like plastic pollution or the loss of biodiversity. And on that, let's listen to what Germany's climate minister Robert Habeck had to say.
It's become clear that climate protection is not only an industrial or energy issue, but that the vulnerability of ecological resources, the ocean, coral, soil, degradation, must be considered together with the efforts we're making to save the climate and slow down global warming.
So, Julia, as well as those agreements, we see the US and Germany have done a separate deal.
Yes, they signed a new energy partnership between the two countries, and it is a partnership that ties into the discourse coming, for example, from the US's climate envoy, John Kerry, who referred to the US and Germany as first movers in terms of countries moving towards a transformation, towards a sustainable, renewable energy production. And also it plays into this plan by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to initiate a so-called climate club, a group of leading countries in terms of transformation towards more renewable energy production, where countries like Germany and the US can push for the development of new technologies, for example, in the fields of hydrogen or offshore wind, to really manage to give more steam and momentum to the energy transformation.
And of course, the war in Ukraine is everywhere. What sort of impact has it had on this G7 meeting?
It was definitely one of the top topics discussed here at the summit, and a lot of the ministers who spoke at press conferences and at events made clear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its consequences have put the focus on the connection between security, energy sourcing and climate change. And it has made it even more relevant for countries within the G7, for example, Germany or Italy, to become quickly independent from Russian fossil fuels. Now, the challenge there is to make sure that this move away from Russian energy sources doesn't bring G7 countries to rely more heavily on fossil fuels from other countries and other sources in the long term, but that this move away from these Russian fossil fuels actually leads to a transformation towards a bigger use of renewable energy.
Thank you, Julia. Julia Saudelli in Berlin.
Well, we can talk now with Canadian Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson. He's joining us from the G7 summit in Berlin. Thanks for taking the time, Minister. The G7 energy and climate ministers have agreed to phase out coal in the energy sector. When could we see a complete phase out of coal use, do you think?
Well, I mean, the focus is phasing it out as quickly as possible. I think the focus for many of us is by the end of 2030 or by 2030. Canada and the United Kingdom have been leading for the past number of years what's called the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and that really is focused on getting us off coal by 2030, which is a critical first step to achieving the Paris climate goals.
It seems like a big asterisk, though, the war. How much of an impact is the war in Ukraine having on these timelines, these aggressive timelines like 2030?
Well, in a strange way, I don't think it's actually having a big impact on the timelines. What we're seeing is, in the short term, a real desire to displace Russian oil and gas, for sure, and looking to countries like Canada and the United States to help with that. But it's also really got everybody focused on accelerating the transition to renewables and hydrogen and moving as quickly as we possibly can. I think the interesting thing that came out of the conversations at the G7 were how inextricably linked the energy security and the climate issues are, and that we need to make progress in order to address both.
And how easy is that message to sell, that security is linked to renewables and that's the reason we must accelerate?
Well, I mean, look, the dependence on Russian oil and gas that Europe is feeling right now clearly is an energy security issue. It is also a climate issue, as we have to move away from the combustion of hydrocarbon resources. And so the way in which for Europe to enhance its domestic energy security is to produce much more of its energy resources domestically through the deployment of renewables, and to look to source clean sources of energy like hydrogen from stable democratic countries like Canada.
Europe wants to end its reliance on Russian gas pretty clearly. Canada could help fill the gap and start supplying natural gas to EU countries. How are you going to square your obligations with those to limit global warming? Is it possible those two things can happen concurrently?
Well, I think it is, and we are looking at that, and we are talking to the government of Germany, but also the European Union about that. There's a couple things that you need to do to ensure that you are making progress consistent with your climate commitments. One is to ensure that domestic emissions associated with the production of LNG are low, so ensuring that, for example, you're using electricity as part of the process to create the liquid natural gas. But you also have to look at your displacing Russian natural gas, so you're not actually creating any more emissions in the use of natural gas. But you also have to have a view about how you will transition those facilities to producing hydrogen down the road, which is where we all need to get to. We need to get to the point where we are not burning natural gas, we are not burning oil, we are actually using clean fuels like hydrogen. And so that is exactly the conversation that we've been having with Germany and with the European Union.
The other conversation relates to the poorest and most vulnerable who will bear the brunt of climate change. Minister, why aren't G7 countries doing more to protect them?
Well, I mean, there's a whole range of issues implied in the question. I mean, the first and foremost commitment that the developed world made was to catalyze the collection of $100 billion a year that would be used to help developing countries to both mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. At the most recent COP in Glasgow, actually Germany and Canada led the work to ensure that we actually were going to get to the $100 billion number, and we are on track to get there by next year. But of course, we're also going to have to look at issues around the damage that is being caused in the developing world and how we can work together to ensure that we are actually proactively trying to ensure that we're addressing that going forward. It is absolutely the case that the countries that are the least responsible for the climate crisis are the ones that are paying the most.
Canadian Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, we appreciate your time. Thanks.